On guitar, we learn scales visually without any idea what the notes are and what their function is. Today, I'm going to go over a different way of thinking about scale patterns, and they're going to make sense and make much better results. So stay tuned. Oh, we're going to do that one over again. Yeah, we're going to try that one more time, everybody. On guitar, we learn scales visually without any idea what the notes are and what their function is. Today, I'm going to go over a different way of thinking about scale patterns that make sense and give much better results. So stay tuned. Hello and welcome, friends, to episode 138 of the Play Guitar Podcast. I'm Lee, and this is the podcast that's determined to make you a better guitar player. No matter if you're just starting out or you've been playing for years, this is the show that will help you become the guitarist that you always wanted to be. Well, hey, everybody, we're just going to hang out today. We're going to talk about something that's been coming up a lot lately, and I just kind of wanted to clear the air on this subject. We're going to hang out. We have a little discussion about guitar scale patterns. If you've listened to the show before, you've heard me talk about a very frequent topic that comes up. Why do my solos always sound like I'm practicing scales? If I had a nickel for every time I heard that, right? So I always thought this is really common. You get scale patterns. Maybe it's a teacher, maybe you want to learn a certain style of music, and you get a sheet of paper or a computer screen with a bunch of dots on it, right? And then we're expected to make music out of dots, right? It's crazy. We don't know why these dots are supposed to work. We don't know how to practice them correctly to get the most from them. What are you supposed to do? Usually we get asked to practice them up and down. But that's without that next key part that's needed to make sense out of all of this, practicing them to a chord or a chord progression. You see, this is important. Not all notes in a scale are equal. They're not all created equal. Did you know that just because a note is in a scale doesn't mean it's a good choice to play every single time? You think, well, it's in the scale, it should work, right? Not exactly. So today I'm going to start from the beginning. We're going to quickly run through the key concepts you need at different places along your journey to make sense of scales, to make sense of scale patterns so that you aren't intimidated by them and you can start making music instead of going up and down scales. Okay, so here we go. And this is open. We have the chat going right now. So if anyone has questions along the way, I'm open to that today. Just got really an outline of all the things that everybody, if they change their thinking about this, save you a lot of headaches and a lot of time. So this is more of a discussion than me just hitting a bunch of points. But let's start from the beginning. What's a scale pattern? Right? If you came from any other instrument, you don't see things like this. This is a guitar thing. Okay. So what is a scale pattern? Well, it's a collection of notes in a certain part of the guitar neck. That's all it is. And scales they're just a collection of notes. And those notes are separated by distances. And that's the most important thing to get in the beginning. Intervals. You'll hear that word intervals a lot. And distances between notes are super important. They determine all these sounds that we hear, all these different songs, and they have different, and especially when you're first starting out and you're thinking, well, why does this song sound the way it does? Why does this song? And even it goes down to the chords, to the bass lines, to the vocal melodies, and to the guitar parts, right? It's the distances between notes determine how things sound. And scale patterns are just the notes in a collection of that are across the whole fretboard. Okay. So we're not playing piano. Obvious, right? We're not playing piano. Well, why is that important? Well, because most people, when you go to, I don't know, take a music theory class, or you try to figure out what it is that you're working on, when they show how chords and scales work, they show it on a piano keyboard, right? And the reason why is because it's laid out very nicely. Here's your C note, here's your C sharp right next to it, here's your D note, two keys up from that, and that's it. If you want to play that D note, they'll call it like, D3 or D2 in a certain octave. There is only one way to play that note. That's it. You press that note, boom. Now there's other Ds in different octaves, but in that octave, that sound of that note, there's only one way to play it. In guitar, that's not the case. In the guitar, things overlap. Every one of our strings is like a little piano, and then we have 6 of them, and you can find the exact same sounding note on different strings. This is where the confusion starts. Okay, the guitar strings overlap. So when we have these different, if you check out different scale patterns, they're the same scale in one place or the next or the next or the next. The patterns are completely different. They look like punch cards or like old time computer cards, right? So if you saw those patterns on the whole fretboard, okay, how would you start? How would you tackle that? If you thought of a C major scale and it was presented to you, every single note that's in a C major scale on the guitar, it'd be overwhelming. It's huge. You'd be intimidated. Where do I start? It's tough to play. So if you did that on the piano, it would be all one after another. You'd see the same pattern over and over and over again from each octave. Guitar's not like that. So when you take a look at the way guitar patterns are presented to you, you'll have a whole bunch of dots in a certain place of the guitar. It's usually within a 4 fret, maybe 5 or even 6 if you really stretch, but it's within a 4 fret span. Okay, they're in something what old time guitar players used to call grips, right? Areas where you can get a scale pattern and a chord and all of those things in one section. And then you focus on that. And when you want to play that same exact scale in another place of the guitar, you have to learn a new grip or a new scale pattern. This is more manageable. It's easier to wrap your head around. We can think about it. Okay, well, I can handle 4 frets. I can figure something out in 4 frets, but I can't think of the whole guitar. Well, what happens is when you learn just one pattern, a lot of people do that. They'll learn one pattern and they'll stop. Well, I've got my scale right there and I can do that, and I'm good. I'm good to go. Okay. The more manageable it can get, the more accessible the guitar is. And what we try to learn, and a lot of our founding members can attest to that, is we try to learn the guitar in different positions, the different patterns. And in fact, there's different kinds. Most of us are learning the 5 pattern guitar shapes, and it's a series of dots, series of dots, series of dots, series of dots. Okay, so that's kind of the beginning of it. Well, let's keep moving on from that. Let's talk about the what and the how of guitar scale patterns. So we're learning these to learn to play scales. Okay, well, what scale would you want to play? Say you only learned one scale, and this was you wanted to master one scale. Which one would you pick? Well, we're going to pick the major scale. Okay, this is going to give you the most bang for your buck. Now, I also teach the minor pentatonic too, just because a lot of the music we listen to is in minor pentatonic. But in a second, you're going to realize why the major scale actually helps you with that in the first place. So if you're going to master the major scale, it would get you 95% of all of the other scales from the patterns that you learned. We're going to get a lot of mileage out of that minor scale. There are other scales that we can get from the major scale. So if you learn the major scale across the whole neck of the guitar in all different keys, you're doing a lot more than just that one sound. And let me tell you what you can learn from that. You can learn pentatonic scales. Now, pentatonic scales are 5-note scales. C major scale. It's a 7-note scale where the 8th note is where it starts over again. It's the octave. Pentatonic scales are 5-note scales, and they come directly from the major scale. Okay, so when you have your major scale and you remove 2 of the notes, and there's different pentatonic scales too. We're going to get into that in a few minutes. When you remove 2 of the notes, you start to hear some interesting things. I mean, there's specific notes that we would remove, but blues music, minor pentatonic scales. Folk music, country music, major pentatonic scales. Those are the two of the big 4 scales that we learn, but they come directly from the major scale. How about modes? What else can we do with a major scale other than removing notes? Well, we can start our strong note at a different place. That's where we get some new sounds. So modes are those, we're going to talk a little bit more about modes in the next section, but they're the ones with the big fancy names, and they have a little bit different sound. And but basically what we're doing is we're taking these scale patterns, and I'm going to do this is C major pattern 5. It plays over C chord. If we took that same scale pattern and started with the 2nd note D and played from that note to its octave using the same notes, we get a whole different sound. And that's a sadder sound. That's called a Dorian mode. And we're going to get into all the different modes in a few minutes. But we're using the scale patterns now for not just the full major scale. We can take notes away to get pentatonic scales, and we can start on a different note to get different sounds called modes. And each note in the scale, if you start from that note and continue with the same scale patterns, you get the different modes. How about exotic scales? How can we get odd sounding scales just from our regular major scale? Well, if you look at a lot of these different sounding, odder sounding scales, Hungarian minor, the Persian scale, on and on and on like that, you see that they're written. Let's talk about Hungarian minor. Okay, Hungarian minor scale. This when you go to learn that, they'll say, oh, it's easy. It's just 1, 2, flat 3, sharp 4, 5, flat 6, 7. Okay, those are those numbers are the numbers of the major scale: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And the alterations that you see, flat or sharp, tell you what to do to get this new sound from a major scale. So let's do that. Let's take our C major scale here. Let's make it on the same pattern. And let's play a Hungarian minor scale. Okay? Right? So let's read it. We have 1. Well, we got that. 2, we've got that. No changes. But now 3 is flat. So instead of an E, we're going to play E flat. Okay? So C, D, E. Now the 4th note in the key of C is F. But this wants to be a sharp. So sharp 4. 5 is the same between. Okay, the 6 is A, but in this case, it says a flat 6. Let's see here. So 1, 2, flat 3, sharp 4, 5, flat 6. 7 is the same. Very different sounding scale. Okay, Hungarian minor. It's one you don't hear too often. I have heard it in some heavy metal and things like that back in the 80s, but just making those changes based on our scale patterns that we already know. So I'm not having to learn a whole new scale. I'm not having to learn all new patterns. If I know my major scale patterns extremely well, then it's very easy to just change a note here and there to get all new sounds. So basically, everything that we're doing comes back to understanding your major scales. All right. So let's talk about how to learn scale patterns. What's the problem? So when you go to start playing the scale pattern, right? You see it on the page. Let's just do a minor scale. That's basically what you do. You play it up and play it back. And then you think, okay, I've got the scale, I'm ready to play. The problem is that once you start doing that, it doesn't sound all that great. And people start to get upset. They think, I've done it. This is supposed to match completely to this background track. Usually that's where you go. And as you find out, when you start to land on different notes, some work better than others. And what I would do is I would have you approach it a new way. And I would play them over one chord that's looped. So if you have a loop pedal like Coke does, I see Coke in the chat. We're going to get to the chat in just a second. If you have a loop pedal, just playing an A minor. In fact, I'm going to do that here. Let's see here. Bad loop. Let's try a new loop. So when I played through the scale, I took my time to listen to which notes matched nicely and which ones didn't. Okay, we have three types of notes, really. There's weak notes, there's strong notes, and there's wrong notes. Okay, and sometimes actually the wrong notes are the best notes of all. Okay, so we're going to go from figuring out, well, let's figure out what the two. We know that this is a scale pattern. We're going to stick to the scale pattern. So none of these are considered wrong notes. But we're going to try and figure out which ones are weak notes and which ones are strong notes. So let's take a listen again. So here's my first note. Now that's a strong note. It matches. If I play that note and finished, I'm good to go. Let's try our second note here. How does that sound? not very strong. It doesn't feel good sitting there. Let's move it to the next note. Now that matches. I can hear that it sounds nice with the chord. I can play it and feel reasonably comfortable that it was over. How about the next note? This is the fourth in the minor. It wants to go somewhere. I wouldn't feel comfortable ending a lick on that note. How about the next? Now that matches. Okay. How about our flat six? It's a nice sounding note, but it's not a matching note. Now the seventh, this is just a triad. It doesn't sound bad, but it's not the strongest note, which we get back to here. Okay? So we found that there were 3 notes that were very strong, and the rest of them felt like they should be going somewhere else. They should move. And spending the time going through these scale patterns like this in the beginning is going to save you tons of time. The approach that most people take when they learn scale patterns is they want to play them fast. They want to play them smoothly. And I would present to you that it's more important to determine what those notes do as you're playing them. Now, in our founding members and our new coaching students, each week we start targeting different notes as we go through an improv over a chord progression. The fewer the chords, the better at first, right? So if it's just going back and forth between 2 chords, targeting those 3 strong notes, or if we're using 7 chords, those 4 strong notes, and using the other notes to move between them. That is like, going straight to the to the end of the game, right? Going past all the problems that you would be, beating your head against the wall. Okay, I'm playing these scales. I don't understand why they don't sound good. So we've got weak notes, strong notes, and wrong notes. So wrong notes are any of the notes that are not in the scale. Now, at first we stay away from wrong notes because it's a smart idea to be able to start with notes that are consonant, right? And to be able to really understand what the inside notes are, the most melodic notes are. But sometimes tension can be a good thing. Sometimes if I just play this, that first note, that's a half step behind the root. That's a major second. Okay. That note shouldn't work. It's not in the scale. It's not in the chords. Doesn't sound particularly correct if you were to just be practicing the scale up and down. But it added tension. It was used for effect. So I have made a decision to go away from the scale, which is something that you can do too. And they may be considered wrong notes, but if you use them intentionally for that purpose of adding tension into a line, they can sound fantastic. So we're understanding, let's kind of recap here. We're understanding what a scale pattern is. It's a collection of notes. We've got a bunch of dots in a grip. Okay, we're not playing piano. It's not all laid out for us. We have a bunch of strings that overlap, which makes it difficult. And our hands are only so big, so we can only, play what's underneath our fingers. So that's why we break this up into sections. That's the first thing to understand about scale patterns. Then we talked about the what and how. The what is, what scale should I learn if I'm only going to use one, and why? Because we can get almost all the other scales. And we'll talk about the ones that we can't from that one scale. Then we just talked about how to learn scale patterns. We play them over a chord and we identify the weak notes, the strong notes, and the wrong notes. But as you start looking through online to find different scale patterns, those kind of things, you're going to start to see some differences in the way scale patterns are presented to you. And we've talked about this. The one I think is best place to start with scale patterns is the 5-pattern system. Some people call it the caged. I don't teach caged. I don't find it sticks with you long enough. It's great to get people kind of up and running, but it doesn't. At some point, it kind of helps people you hit a wall with the cage. But so we take that. I call it a 5-pattern system. There's also the 7-pattern system, and that is where you have a scale pattern that's based. The first note is each note of a major scale, all the way down, and that is usually referred to as 3 notes per string. 7-pattern system, 3 notes per string, and we've had a whole podcast on that. And it's a great way to play legato, and it's a great way to play faster, and it's also a great way to move because they stretch across the guitar. It's a great way to go from a low note to a high note relatively quickly. There's also the 12-pattern system. Okay, and that's not something that a lot of people talk about too much. Guys, there was a teacher online I used to watch his video, Pepper Brown, I think it was. I loved watching his videos, and he talked a lot about the 12-pattern system, and that is having a different pattern for each fret that you could be on. So if your hand is in position 1, where your first finger's at the first fret, there's a pattern, and as you move up 1, there's another pattern and another pattern. So no matter where your hand is on the guitar, you have a pattern that you need for whatever scale, whatever chord you're playing on. That gets it gets so difficult so quickly. It's a very, very, if it's something you can master, it's awesome, but it takes a lot of time and a lot of practice there. So let's go. We've got one more section left, but I do want to go to the chat. I said we're going to be a little bit less structured today and take a look here. So Evan says, this sounds like so much information, but it really comes along more easily when you get to it in time. Yeah, it's a lot easier than you think it is. It looks very intimidating at first. And then Brendan says, that's what I'm finding as well. The more I work with the scale patterns, the easier they become. It's learning that builds up over time for sure. And then Evan says, absolutely. And when he talks about the strong notes and finding the 3rd and 5th, it isn't so difficult. Right. We're also building our ear when we do those things too. Okay. Coke's talking about modes. We're going to talk about that. And in a few minutes. And let's see here. Just one. Evan says, learning the major and minor thirds are better than caged, easy to build chords with them all over the neck. Right. And also, arpeggios is a big thing, but with caged, you kind of get stuck in the, a certain arpeggio shapes, and you don't realize that there's a lot more sounds that you can get from that for sure. And Coke says, I've not heard of the 12 pattern. Yeah, it's different. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and so let's move on to our last section, and then we're going to open up for questions and do some more hanging out after that. So last section, and this goes to one of the chat questions we talked about, is tell yourself that scales are easy. Why? Because scales are easy. They're very easy. And I'm going to tell you everything that you could find, any scale that you could find comes from one of these 3 little sections that we're going to talk about right now. So the majority of scales are based around the major scale, but they could also be based around intervals, and they could also be based around arpeggios. So if you understand basic intervals, a half step, a whole step, and a minor third, you've got some really fancy scales that you could use. Also, if you understand some arpeggios, in particular, the dominant 7th arpeggio, the root, the 3rd, the 5th, and the flat 7th. And if you know those across your guitar, there's a really, really cool scale that you could get under your fingers quickly and easily. So the major, minor, pentatonic, those are taking away notes from the major scale. Okay, so you know your major scale patterns and you take some notes away. You've got your pentatonic shapes. You've got your modes. And so we said we're going to talk about modes today. Now let's go back to clean. We did Dorian. We'll do Phrygian. That starts on the third note of the scale. Very distinctive sound because we're starting on the third, and there's a half step between the third note of the scale and the fourth note of the scale. So, right? The next is Lydian. This is where we start on the fourth note of the scale. Okay? That has we're going to raise what would normally be in a major scale, the fourth note. When we play it as a mode in this scale pattern, it automatically raises that fourth note in F. Okay, and gives us a really nice airy kind of sound. Five's Mixolydian. That gives us our dominant sound. It has a flat seventh in the new key that you're playing in. In this instance, in the key of C, we start from G. We play from G to G on the C scale, right? The next one, the sixth, is Aeolian. Okay, that's our natural minor scale. Okay, and the last one starts on the seventh degree. So in C, C, D, E, F, G, A, B. If we play from B to B using these notes, that's called the Locrian mode. Okay, it's a lot more tension in that one than all the other ones. So we've just taken our major scale. We talked about pentatonics. We've talked about modes now, getting 7 or 6 other sounds other than the one from starting on the first. But there's also other modes that you could use too, based on the melodic minor, the harmonic minor, and the pentatonic scale. Each one of those, you can take that same idea. You can start on a different note of those scales and get a whole other idea. From our melodic minor and harmonic minor, we get those from taking the major scale and adjusting 1 or 2 of the notes. And from doing that, you can add on to it. It does get more complicated, but not really. If that's the sound that you're looking for, it's worth going through and learning all the melodic minor alterations to the major scale to get that melodic minor scale, and then you can do modes on top of that. Really interesting stuff. But what I want to get to here is something called symmetrical scales. And symmetrical scales are one of the few things that we can do that we don't have to base on a major scale. But it's even easier. It's a scale that's based on intervals. Okay? And we have 3 we're going to talk about today. We have the diminished scale, the whole tone scale, and the augmented scale. And the way we do these, it's even easier as we go from, let's take diminished, for example. We're going to start on C. And we're going to, instead of worrying about the major scale, we're going to play a half step and then a whole step over and over and over and over again. It's called a half whole scale. You can also flip it. You could start at the whole step and go half step too. Those are 2 different uses for those. But let's just do the half whole scale first, okay? So for C, I'm going to do this on one string just to demonstrate first. Um, Now I played that. I took it across across the strings, but play that all on one string. It's just a series of half steps and whole steps. So we could do the opposite. We could do whole step then half step. Starting on C. Sounds like the same scale, but it works differently than the half step, whole step. We're going to talk about that in a second because we have our next section, which we'll get into that. But the whole tone scale is another one that is a symmetrical scale. We can get it by using the thought of just using intervals. So we're not dealing with the major scale. The whole tone scale, every note in that scale has a distance of 2 frets apart. Very different sound, right? It's very kind of airy. And we didn't have to really, go into a whole lot of depth and detail to get that sound. We started on a note and we just went whole step, whole step, whole step, whole step, and then the way back. Pretty neat. And there's another one too called the augmented scale. Now, the augmented scale, it deals with intervals in this order: a minor third and then a half step. Okay, so let's see if we'll do it all on one string. So here's a C augmented scale. So a minor third from C is E flat, and then a half step from E flat is E. Pretty easy. I don't use that scale a whole lot. I don't. It's a different sound. But this is something that can be discovered using intervals, minor third to a half step. So these are 3 different ways of getting some very interesting sounds, usually a lot of tension in symmetrical scales. So they don't fit that whole, half. They go away from that and then sometimes come back to it too. So they're interesting. There's one more type of scale that is very easy to get. So far, we've done everything that works off of the major scale. We've done symmetrical scales. And then we're also going to take 2 of these symmetrical scales and we're going to start thinking about them in an even easier way of playing them. And that's creating scales around arpeggios. Okay? Scales around arpeggios. If you know your arpeggios, make life very easy. And in fact, I talked about the dominant 7 arpeggio earlier. So we're going to talk about C7 arpeggio, C dominant 7. That has a C, an E, a G, and a B flat. Now we can use half steps around these notes to get our diminished scale. Above the root, we're going to go half step. And behind all of the other notes of the arpeggio, we're going to do half steps. Okay, so root, half step, And then behind each other note of every other note of the arpeggio, we're going to do a slide in from behind. And when you use the half whole scale pattern over that C7 chord, when you can see those arpeggio notes, you automatically know what the strong notes are and what the weak notes are, and get a really cool scale with a lot of tension. The other scale pattern that is built around arpeggio shapes is the augmented scale. The augmented scale we talked about before was a minor third to a half step. But if you look at those notes, it's really two augmented triads together. Okay? So C, we have C, E flat, E, G, G sharp, B. Okay, so if I went every other note with that, C, E, G, let's see. C, E, G sharp. Okay, and then we have B, E flat, G. So we have a B, E flat, G, and a C, E, G sharp. The E flat would be a D sharp. B, D sharp, G, C, E, G sharp. Putting all of those notes together, if, like I said, I don't use this scale too often, but if you put all of those notes together, those are two augmented triads together, they give you that sound. So what we're having is 3 easy ways of getting pretty much all of the scales you need. The question came up in the chat I saw as I was going on. So how many scales are there? There's a lot of different scales. There's a lot of scales in different styles of music in different countries, their styles of music. There's a ton. I haven't sat down to check. But it's a whole bunch. But if you boil them down to the major scale, symmetrical scales, and outlining arpeggios, you can get almost all of the ones that you're going to need. Okay, so let's take a few questions here before we wrap up the podcast. Let's see here. Evan says, I found good use for an arpeggio and a solo, and I felt like I discovered a little secret. Right? Yeah. Yeah. And Coke says, I've been really laying into arpeggio sweep picking, trying to get it as smooth and speed as I can, so I can throw that into solos too. Yeah. When you talk about sweep picking, Evan says, mouth hangs open, my drool. It's just a technique. Sweep picking is a lot of fun, but it takes a while to master. But you can get a lot of benefits from sweep picking just from hybrid picking, which we talked a little bit about before, where if you're playing scale patterns and you're already picking downstroke and then you're changing to the next string down, you can just play downstrokes through all of them and get some of the benefits of sweep picking without doing the huge 80s style stuff. Okay. Well, so that is what I think are the things that hold a lot of people back with scales, as far as getting started with practicing scales, developed in your ear when you have scale patterns, and being intimidated when you see all of these different scales. They all kind of boil down to one master scale and then 2 little techniques you can get for some different types of scales. And so that's I do have a 3-note per string scale pattern download for you. So if you're interested in getting into scales and scale patterns a little bit more, you can incorporate these patterns into your practice. You'll be able to play all 7 patterns of 3-note per string major scale in all 12 keys. That's at playguitaracademy.com/3NPS. You can also check the show notes for this podcast. And I'm going to call it. That's a wrap. Thanks for joining me today for the Play Guitar Podcast. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast player. Also, I really appreciate if you could leave a review for the show. If you're just starting, you're new to the guitar, head over to Start Here Guitar and check out my premium 11-week beginner course that will give you the foundation you need to move forward correctly on the guitar. Follow me on all of my different social media pages. Links to them are playguitaracademy.com. Thanks again. I'll see you on the next episode. And then I'm not really gone. We're going to hang out here and talk in the chat. I want to go back a little bit farther too. I missed a couple good ones. So that's the end of the audio podcast, but we're going to have a little bit more here with the video podcast. So I'm scrolling back. So this is what I wanted to talk about modes a little bit. Coke says mode usage confuses me. Not so much what they are, but if you're starting at a different note, do you play all the way through to get that sound? You don't have to. You don't have to. If you're playing over, let's just take Dorian, for example, right? So we're in the C major scale, right? But there's a D chord playing. And that's our one chord. That's the strong chord of the song. If you only played D, E, and F, would that be Dorian? You could just say that was minor. You could be just playing a D minor scale. What makes this Dorian, what makes it different, is this note right here, is the B. So in a natural minor, you have a B flat. But in Dorian, that C major scale puts this altered note into the scale pattern. So if you never hit this note, right, there's no way to differentiate between the Dorian or the minor scale. If you don't hit a B flat or a B, it could be minor or Dorian. Either way, that's the sound that makes it Dorian. That's the sound that makes it minor, just regular natural minor. If you just it wouldn't matter what scale patterns that you're playing. If you don't hit that B note in there, it's not going to sound like Dorian. So this is a way for us to get to that sound, if that makes sense. I think I got it. So let me go back through your question. Not so much what they are, but if you're starting at a different note, do you play it all the way through to get that sound? Yeah, if you don't play all the way through, say, like I just said, if you play just the first three notes, you're not hitting the notes that make it Dorian. You're only hitting the notes that make it minor. Okay. He says you just playing that one interval to get that sound, etc. And let's see here. Let me go. I got new comments. Let me. Coach says, "Aha, there it is." I guess I do understand modes and was overthinking it. Yeah, modes are. Let me just go through them. Okay, so if you were just to play D minor chord and play D natural minor, that would just be a regular minor scale. But if you raise that sixth note, you'd be playing in Dorian. And when we use our C major scale and start on the second degree, it makes it easy to get that sound. Okay, automatically puts that Dorian note in there for us. So we don't have to learn a new scale pattern. We don't have to alter our minor scale. We can just play major scale and say, I want to play Dorian. I'll play off the second note of C major. But let's go to the next one. Let's go to Phrygian. Let's see what we've got here. So we've got E, right? The next note is F. Okay. Now in a regular E minor, the second note is F sharp. So we're already lowering the second note of the scale. If we just played if we skip that second note altogether, that's not a Phrygian sound. You have to have that lowered second note to get a Phrygian sound. And so the process is, I want a Phrygian sound. How can I get that? Well, I know my major scales. If I start on the third note, I can get Phrygian all over the neck all day long. Okay? I think that was where we were going with that. Okay. I'm going to go back a little bit too. Let's see here. And then it said, so when jamming or whatever, I jam in C but land on D, basically. Yeah, that's the first step. But when we go through, I told you about in the podcast, when you go through a scale pattern and just play it over one chord, right? And listen to what notes are strong and what notes are weak. The same thing works for modes too. And in fact, the notes that are strong in major are going to be completely different when you have a different chord underneath it. So a major chord is C, E, and G. So if I played here, strong, weak, strong, weak, strong, right? So I've got my arpeggio notes. Those are my strong notes. But say that the chord D minor is being played. Those strong notes aren't strong anymore because I've got D minor playing. Well, what are the strong notes for this? D, F, and A. Those become my new strong note. So that first step is playing from D to D using the C major scale. That gives us the Dorian sound. But you if you play for a while over just a D chord, you start to find out, yeah, not every note sounds. I've got strong and weak notes for this as well too. So, okay, everybody, those are the things that most people struggle with when it comes to scale patterns. I did the beginners, which usually the biggest problem with beginners is they start and they see all the dots and they're not sure even why they're playing them, and then they say, okay, play them from low to top to bottom. And so for the beginners, I told them why those notes are picked, why the distances between them are important. Then we went to intermediate players, and for intermediate players, strong notes and weak notes, that's always the problem. Why is everything I play sound like a scale? Because you're landing on weak notes a lot of the time when the strong note would be better and would be more melodic. And then for more advanced players, we got into symmetrical scales and scales built off of arpeggios. That could be a next step. So I tried to have a little something for everybody in this one. I tried to take the main stuck in a rut points when it comes to scale patterns, and I hope that helped everybody. And I had a lot of fun hanging out with you today. I haven't improvised over a blues progression in forever. Did that this morning. Boy, am I out of practice. Yeah. It's always good to kind of keep up every once in a while. So, okay, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and call it. The coaching videos, I'm going to start working on those, and for I'm a day behind on those. But I've got Saturdays all finished. I'm going to finish up Sunday's videos today. I'm going to go ahead and get started getting those out, and hopefully have them up tonight so you have them first thing in the morning. And apologize again for getting behind, but we're getting everything straightened out. And I will see you the next time we're going to be on. We're going to be going Saturdays and Mondays for a few weeks. And when I get closer to the move, we may just go to audio podcasts, or I may have a pre-recorded thing ahead of time to keep moving forward, but also have time enough to get set up in the new place so we can have a lot of new stuff. And I'm really getting excited about that. So thank you, Coke and Brennan and Evan, and had a couple more. Dean, Jordan was here. Hi, Jordan. Very cool. Thank you for hanging out, man. I didn't see that one before. Kevin was here. Phil was here. Great to see you, Phil. Let's see here. And I think I got everybody there. So thanks for hanging out with me. And I will see you on Saturday for Guitar Talk. Have a great week. Bye-bye.